but thank you for joining us online. So tonight we have two very accomplished and talented Irish women who are going to talk about the advancement of equality of Irish women, particularly through the second wave of feminism in Ireland. We're joined by Catriona Crowe, who's an activist, archivist, historian, broadcaster, indeed just a wonderful talent and a woman of great accomplishment, who's going to talk about these issues, and she's going to be in conversation with Suzanne Lynch, another very accomplished Irish woman, currently co-author of Politico Europe, EU, formerly Washington correspondent of the Irish Times and Europe correspondent of the Irish Times, and also an academic and talented musician as well. So we have two very talented and accomplished women who are going to rattle the bells and talk about the role of women in Ireland in honour of St. Brigid. So with those introductory remarks, I just want to finish by thanking Eddie Brannigan, whose initiative this was, and the arrangements were made before I arrived. So thank you, Eddie, for the initiative, and we're really looking forward to a very stimulating evening. So Suzanne and Catriona, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ambassador, and thank you very much for having me moderate this conversation with Catriona Crowe. It's my first event with the Embassy of Ireland here in Belgium since moving back to Brussels as a journalist back in September. So delighted to be here for this evening. And it's great to see the event and the occasion of St. Brigid's Day really making a mark throughout the world. A really kind of welcome development by the Department of Foreign Affairs. But it's obviously affords us an opportunity on St. Brigid's Day to think about women's issues and the role of women in Irish identity. But we're also celebrating, commemorating this year another centenary. And it now is a very good opportunity to think and reflect on the foundation of the Irish nation, the role of women in that, and how that was envisaged, and how the creation of the Irish state was in many ways based on a very, I would say, very conservative view of women. And it's given us an opportunity, I think, to look and see what role women played in the idea of nation 100 years on since Irish independence. So delighted to be joined by Catriona Crowe for this conversation. Catriona, we're going to spend the next while, and just to say to people as we go on here, you're very welcome to ask questions in the Q&A function. We'll be keeping an eye on those. But Catriona, just to start off, I mean, the focus of your talk here this evening is very much going to be the second wave of Irish feminism. But let's start with the first wave of Irish feminism, see where how this all emerged. And we're talking really from around 1860 to 1918, when Ireland was, of course, part of the UK. But maybe you could start and talk about that before we get into the second wave proper.
Sure. And I want to thank Eddie Brannigan for inviting me to be here, and the ambassador for his very kind words, and to wish him well in his new posting in Brussels. First wave of Irish feminism achieved far more than the vote, which everyone thinks was its main focus, and of course it was. But it also put an end to the Contagious Diseases Acts, which were the sort of focus of a lot of protest in the 1860s, where policemen could stop any women in the street and intimately examine them to find out if they have venereal disease. I mean, we wouldn't fancy that these days, and they didn't then either. There was a huge campaign around that, which succeeded in the 1880s. They achieved huge advances in education for girls and women, intermediate education, secondary education generally, and university education, which was hugely important. And of course, they got the vote. First of all, in 1898, for local government elections, where women could both stand for election and vote, and could become members of county councils, boards of guardians, all of that. And then finally, in 1918, a limited amount of suffrage in line with the United Kingdom under the Representation of the People Act of that year, which allowed women over 30 with a property qualification to vote. So that was not the full kahuna by any means. We finally get full female suffrage, full male and female suffrage under the 1922 Constitution, which is faster than Britain, who did not give all women the vote in 1928. So the first wave was largely dominated by interesting Protestant women, two of the major ones being Isabella Todd from Belfast, who had a huge brief in terms of education and how that would work, and Anna Haslam, a Quaker from Cork, who with her husband Thomas really kept hammering away at the whole issue of the vote. One of the poignant things is that Anna Haslam was 80 when she finally could vote in 1918. And we're told from press reports that she was carried through the streets with floral garlands all around her to the voting station. But of course, there are no photographs, so we don't have any pictorial representation of that. These women believed in a constitutional means. They spent a lot of time having large mass meetings all over Britain and Ireland, lobbying MPs in Westminster, who of course are the people who would eventually change the law. And then they start to be matched by the militant wing, if you like, of feminism at the time, which in Britain was the Women's Social and Political Union, headed up by the Pankhursts, who everybody knows about, and here in Ireland, the Irish Women's Franchise League, which would have involved people like Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, for example. In Britain, they did all kinds of outrageous things. In Ireland, we were fairly timid. They broke windows with toffee hammers. Toffee hammers are not really serious weapons, but they did break a few government windows and were put in jail and force-fed, which is a horrible experience because they went on hunger strike. Two of the WSPU did come here in 1912, attempted to assassinate Herbert Asquith, who was the Prime Minister at the time, in his carriage, missed him with a hatchet just narrowly, and then tried to burn down the Olympia Theatre, Palace Theatre as it was then, by planting a bomb in it. None of these things can be approved of. But what you have are two sets of activities going on in parallel, if you like, and we see that replicated without the violence in the second wave. So you've got the women who sit down and do the hard work about changing legislation, which in the end is what you've got to get, and women who are there to consciousness raise, to draw attention to a cause, to do all of those things. So we get to 1922, women have made significant advances. They have the full vote at this stage. Does that vote change Irish society in the way that many of its protagonists would have wished? No, it does not. Women, like their male counterparts, for political parties. Many Irish women are deeply conservative Catholics. We are looking at a deeply conservative Catholic state after 1922. And throughout the 1920s and 30s, we see various women's rights being rolled back: the right to contraception, the right to divorce, the right to sit on juries, the marriage bar, which no young woman I know now can ever believe existed, that you had to give up your job when you got married. Discrimination in terms of certain kinds of employment, all of that is going on. So we're looking at a quite inhospitable period from the end of the revolutionary period, conservative revolutionary period, until the 1960s, when we start to be influenced by the waves of what is happening elsewhere.
So what you're describing there, Catriona, is so interesting in that the first wave of feminism, as you describe it, was very progressive, made a lot of progress. And there's an irony then, when we get to the early 1920s and the creation of a new state, in fact, a lot of those advances are rolled back.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you lay the blame for that? I mean, why did that happen? Why did this this movement towards progress, in fact, kind of be reversed or stopped in its tracks at that point?
I mentioned deeply conservative Catholics. That is the main reason. Conservative Catholicism at that period did not approve of women working outside the home. They didn't necessarily think they should have much of an education. Her greatest ambition as a woman was to marry, look after your husband, and have children, which is very, very conservative indeed. And that view was shared by a lot of women. We have to remember that women are not a homogeneous group who all think the same way now, no less than then. You have that, but you also have what you always have after a war. During the First World War, which finished, as you know, in 1918, women got out to work because they were needed. So a lot of women in Ireland, for example, worked in munitions factories. A lot of Irish women went to work in Britain for the war effort in various ways. All that vanishes really quickly. Once the war is over, demobbed soldiers are coming back looking for jobs. People think men are entitled to jobs, women are not. Okay, we needed them when there was war. We don't need them anymore. Exactly the same thing happens during the Second World War. So that's another sort of geopolitical event that affects how women are treated after independence.
Yeah, and then it is here. I mean, yeah, it kind of culminates in a way, though, with the Constitution in 1937, with a woman's place in the home. I mean, was that a significant moment? That kind of constitutional.
It's a very significant moment. I mean, in one way, the 1937 Constitution is a terrific Bill of Rights, particularly given the period in which it's passed. In the 1930s, the lights are going off all over Europe, you know, descending into fascism. Rights are being abolished in the most savage way everywhere. Our Constitution still stands up largely as a decent Bill of Rights, and we'll be talking later about Maeve McGee and how that Constitution actually helped her to get a significant right that was necessary for women. But it did squarely place women in the home, Article 41.2, I think it is, where that was laid out as being the desirable place for women to be, and that nothing should prevent them, i.e. employment, from taking their place in the household and doing all of that. So you get a lot of people buying into this, including a lot of women.
Yeah. So what you're painting then is, you know, the interwar period, the foundation and the bedding down of the Irish state is a very conservative kind of idea of nationhood, with a very specific idea of the role of women. So second wave of feminism, the 1960s, right? So how does what's happening in Ireland fit internationally? Is the international movement, does that start having an impact on the issue of feminism in Ireland?
For this, we have to go back to ideas. Everything starts with ideas. And the seminal central text of feminism to this day is Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which was published in French in 1949 and in a bungled but still fascinating translation, English translation in 1953. Her publisher in the States, Alfred Knopf, didn't realize that this was a philosophical treatise. He thought it was a zoological enterprise. So he got a zoologist to translate it who knew nothing about philosophy. And Simone de Beauvoir was a philosopher. So, but the basic tenet here is that the big statement that comes out of The Second Sex is, one is not born but becomes a woman, indicating that gender is a cultural and social construct, not a biological determinism. That's as significant as Darwin in lots of ways. Half of the human race is suddenly being told, you can see yourself in a different way. You are not biologically determined to do certain things. There are all kinds of other things you can do as well. Lots of people here in Ireland read it. It was read all over Europe and in America. And hot on the heels of that, we get Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1957, which describes the emptiness in the lives of a lot of suburban women, many of whom were highly educated, who left college, got married, reared children, and found themselves in very lovely houses with big gardens and 3 or 4 children and nothing to do. And who became, as she says herself, we managed to vanquish polio and smallpox. These were replaced by depression and alcoholism, high levels of ill-taking, all of that, depression, misery, the problem, as she said, that has no name. She published in 1957. That became a rallying cry for women no longer feeling guilty about saying, my husband and children are not enough for me. I would like to be doing something with my brain. And then the third leg of the stool is Germaine Greer, who publishes The Female Eunuch a little later in 1970. And that's a real sort of rallying cry. She says, I do not wish to be a female impersonator. I want to be a woman, not a castrate. She hated she was very, very strong. First person to be so strong on the whole business of body image for women, what we're supposed to look like. That's an issue that still affects women today. That is not going away. So she was also a fantastic speaker, flamboyant, beautiful, very controversial. These books were read by everyone here. And also the civil rights movement in the States had an effect just in the north of Ireland in terms of the actual civil rights movement there, but in terms of the concomitant movement for rights for women in the United States, which was ultimately to lead to the battle for the Equal Rights Amendment, unfortunately defeated much later. So the winds of change are blowing around. There are students on the move in France in 1968. This is happening all over the world. and it comes to Ireland. And one of the people who becomes a bridge between first wave feminism and second wave feminism is Hilda Tweedy. Hilda Tweedy was the head of the Irish Housewives Association, which sounds terribly conservative, but was in fact a highly progressive organization that believed in the right to control your own fertility and particularly in consumer rights for women. She, because she's attending a lot of international conferences, realizes that the UN can be lobbied to ask the Irish government to create a commission on the status of women, which they do in 1970. That commission reports, it was headed by Thecla Beer, another really interesting woman who was the first Secretary General of a government department in Ireland. And that report's note in 2 years, a note for all tribunals that take 100 years to report and cost a fortune, and came out with very many seminal recommendations. The ones that we would know most famously would be the introduction of an allowance for unmarried mothers and deserted wives. That signs the death knell, or the beginning of the death knell, for the mother and baby homes, which up to then had been the fate of women who became pregnant outside marriage and had no way of supporting themselves. It was a small allowance, but it made a huge difference to a lot of women who now had the option of keeping their children. Things like the Employment Equality Act of 1977, which enshrined the idea of equal pay, whatever about the practice of it. That was a long battle to get there. The marriage bar is abolished almost immediately, so women can keep their jobs in the public service and later in the private sector. They want help for women who are subject to domestic violence. All of the issues that were obsessing second wave feminism are covered in that report. And at the same
so they really did affect change, this commission on status of the women. It wasn't just a talking shop.
Oh, definitely. No.
It was these specific.
I was right. The other thing we have to remember is we joined the EU in 1973. And the EU, as people have often said, dragged us kicking and screaming into the 20th century, not least in terms of women's rights. The directives in terms of allowances for equal pay and for allowances for vulnerable women came from EU directives. Now, we know that Ireland can be pretty sluggish about implementing EU directives, but they did it and did the right thing in this case. So the 1970s becomes the period when the whole issue of feminism, of women's rights, of reproductive rights starts to take center stage. And I said earlier, there's always two halves to this. The other half to the commission was the Irish Women's Liberation Movement, founded in 1970 by household names that we all know: Nell McCafferty, Mary Marr, June Levine, Nuala Fhuelón, Nuala Fennell. All of these people used to meet in guys' restaurants in Baggot Street and talk about feminism. And they're famous for three things. One, for having a late show in March of 1971, where they were discussing the terrible things that were happening to women. And Mary Kenny, who at that stage was a highly flamboyant person, said that the government didn't give a damn about women. Gareth Fitzgerald, who was in opposition at the time, pops up from his armchair in Palmerston Road, comes into the studio, gets into the studio and sits down and starts defending the government's treatment of women. Chaos ensues. Alas, because of RTÉ's failure to maintain its archive, we do not have a record of it to look at. But everyone remembered it. It got everyone talking. Everybody in those days watched the same TV. There was no streaming services. You watched RTÉ and everyone watched the Late Late Show on a Friday or Saturday night. So that became a big talking point. Next, they had a mass meeting in the Mansion House in April of that year, where they expected a few people. It was on the subject of unmarried mothers. And they were absolutely mobbed. I think they had about 1,500 people at it. Nell McCafferty famously said, "Christ, look at all these lovely women. What are we going to do with them? They think we know what to do." But it was the first time an unmarried mother ever spoke openly about her situation. That was a really brave thing to do. And again, it broke a taboo. The breaking of taboos was really important. And their third famous thing was the train, which probably everybody remembers now. Yeah. Going on a train to Belfast to test the authorities in terms of smuggling contraceptives back into Dublin, which people did all the time. And see,
it was illegal at that time.
Yeah, absolutely illegal to import contraceptives or to use them or to sell them or to do anything with them. So June Levine describes all this wonderfully in her book, Sisters. She was a grown-up, I suppose, in the sense that She was a divorced woman who had come from Canada and knew her way around the world. And she realized when they got to Belfast that most of these young women knew nothing about contraception. They thought you could get the pill or a diaphragm without a prescription. So she had to educate them in a chemist shop and say, sorry, lads, this is not going to work. And Nell McCafferty, clever as always, thought, nobody will know the difference between an aspirin and a contraceptive pill. So let's buy hundreds of aspirins and pretend they're the pill. So they bought those, and they bought condoms, and they bought spermicidal jelly, and they arrived back. Mary Kenny, on the journey back, sat in a carriage, blowing up condoms like balloons and letting them zip around the carriage, to the great scandal of her fellow passengers, who are mostly women who went to Belfast to get bargains and suddenly found themselves with all these extraordinary characters on the way back. So, of course, when they got to Amiens Street Station, the poor customs officers, the most uncomfortable looking people in the footage you ever saw, didn't know what to do with them. And they made a terrible row, and they had a group to meet them there singing "We Shall Overcome." They were allowed to pass. They went around, they were so thorough, they went around to Store Street Station to see if anybody there might like to arrest them. Nobody did. They were let go, which proved that the 1935 Act Against Contraception was just a paper tiger, and this had to be done away with. Huge international publicity, great fun for all and sundry, but a very serious consciousness-raising issue about women's right to control their own fertility.
And yet it was a while before that was changed, that law. I mean, for all the publicity about it.
Believe it or not, we didn't properly legalize contraception in Ireland until 1993. Charlie Haughey came up with the famous Irish solution to an Irish problem in 1979. Now, this is after the McGee case, which we'll go back to, which meant that only married people could be given contraception, which meant there was the war, the vending machines, students' unions, Virgin Megastore, people like that had vending machines with condoms where anybody could get them, and they were prosecuted, and there was all kinds of trouble about it. In 1985, they extended it to non-married people, but only on prescriptions. So you had to get a prescription for a condom, God help us. And that eventually gets wiped away in 1993. So like everything else, this is slow. But in the meantime, people are just doing what they want to do. Even fervent Catholics were utterly dismayed by Humanae Vitae, and women just went to their doctors and said, I have an irregular cycle, can you prescribe the pill for me? As people said, if a Martian visited, they would be absolutely bemused at the menstrual cycles of Irish women. So many of them had to regulate them. So people made their own accommodations, kept going north, smuggled things back, did all that, until finally in 1993, it's legalized for everyone.
So, I mean, again, another irony that they went to Belfast out of Ireland in this new nation to get those rights, if you like, which obviously happened later with abortion. So as well as these kind of big moments, and I think most people on the call probably, particularly the train, and as you said, it was because it was captured, there was footage, whereas, for example, the Late Late Show, we don't have that. But there were also activities happening in the background that people might forget now, and sometimes it's the ordinary people who do extraordinary things. And there is a Mrs. McGee. This is a really interesting story. Maybe you talk a bit about this. I, for one, didn't know much about this, but her court case was really had a massive impact on the law in Ireland.
Yeah. Maeve McGee, as she was known, was a woman who lived with her husband, Seamus, who's a fisherman. They had 4 children by the time she was 27. She'd had a serious stroke after her previous pregnancy. Her doctor, who was James Loughran, who was involved with the Irish Family Planning Association, another great organization that was there to help people get access to contraception. And he had fitted her with a diaphragm, advised her to buy jelly and have it imported, spermicidal jelly. She did. It was impounded by the customs. They refused to give it back to her. And even though he pleaded that her life was in danger if she couldn't prevent pregnancy. So he put her in touch with a solicitor called Dudley Potter, another great hero at the time, and he arranged to go to the High Court to plead her case. The case was pleaded on the basis of freedom of conscience, that people should be allowed to do what they wanted in terms of what their conscience told them, but also the new idea of implied rights in the Constitution, as was happening in the United States, an implied right to privacy for married people to make whatever decisions they wanted. Andreas O'Keefe, who was the head of the High Court, the Chief Justice of the High Court at the time, threw the case out. They appealed it to the Supreme Court, and then they are before 2 of the great innovators of jurisprudence in Ireland at the time, Brian Walsh and Seamus Henchy, who are both very interested in what's happening in the United States, where they're starting to look for implied rights in the American Constitution that are not written down, but they're implicit in what it means. They listened to these arguments, and Billy Fitzgerald, who was the Chief Justice, voted against it. The other 4 justices squarely for it. So she won her case. And she was sitting beside a chap in the public gallery, and he realized she didn't realize what had happened. So he nudged her and said, "Mary, you won." And she said, "Oh, thank God, I can go home now." And she did. And, you know, herself and Seamus got £1,000 for an interview they did with an English newspaper. They were able to buy a house instead of living in a mobile home. They still live in the same house to this day. And they're very quiet, private people, but they should be national heroes and heroines because of what she did.
And how did she, I mean, you've spoken to her, you know, how did she get involved in this hugely high profile case? I mean, what do you put it down to? Why did she
afraid for her life? Her life was threatened by the 1935 Act prohibiting contraception. An absurd situation. At one point during the High Court case, the barristers for the state were asking very intrusive questions. And one of them was to ask Seamus, her husband, do you really want your wife to be using these contraceptives in a patronizing sort of way? And he said, I prefer her to be using contraceptives than to be putting flowers on her grave. That's what was at stake there. That I mean, obviously she was a perfect test case for everyone who wanted the right to contraception. But for Maeve McGee herself, her life was actually threatened by this prohibition. And she was willing to lend her name and her life, her situation, to a case that was going to benefit all kinds of other people, not just her and her husband and their family.
Well, what exactly did this case then achieve? This case by McGee?
It meant that the law of the land now meant that anybody could import contraceptives for their own use and use them. They could not sell them. So that becomes legal directly afterwards. That it has to be because the Supreme Court has pronounced on it. Then you've got the to and froing and all the stuff, Charlie Hoy in 1979 and all the rest of the battles. Then we have the 1980s, of course, which are a different kind of battleground. And perhaps we should tell the audience that while Maeve McGee is undergoing her ordeal in the High Court and the Supreme Court, the conservative right-wing Catholics here in Ireland who didn't want any diminution in any of these laws were noticing Roe v. Wade, 1973, in the United States, where due to an implied right to privacy, the Constitution, the Supreme Court found in favor of a woman's right to have an abortion. And they thought that's coming down the tracks now. We've got to make an effort to stop it. And in a way, the campaign for the 8th Amendment to the Constitution begins directly after Maeve McGee's victory. So it's not just we don't want contraception, they certainly don't want contraception. They fight a rearguard action against that right through, but they want to stop any possibility of abortion. And they move on, they get very brave after 1983, which I have the misfortune to remember vividly, and where 2/3 of the country voted in favor of a really dangerous amendment to the Constitution, which caused nothing but trouble for 35 years. 2 years later, they go to town again on divorce and try to write into the Constitution dreadful stuff that was never going to work. The right to divorce is banned. And again, it's 2/3 majority of the population who vote for that. It really felt like a very inhospitable country for women during the 1980s.
So in that, the 1973 judgment in the US, which is going to be marked 50 years next year, has a huge impact and a fear factor for the Conservative majority in Ireland. And they say themselves, we don't want to know what's happening over there. And one of the issues now for Roe v. Wade, that crucial judgment, is that it was based on the idea of the women's right to privacy. So that is why I think I'm right in saying it is a weak ruling, in the sense that we're now in a situation in the United States where it's very possible this could be overturned, and we now have a Conservative majority in the Supreme Court. So they were trying to kind of get it in to this amendment in, which eventually happened at the 8th Amendment, and then follow that up with divorce from that. So it is interesting in a different way that these international trends were being closely watched in Ireland as a kind of warning.
Yeah, I mean, people like Spock and Clack, the pro-life is such an annoying term, you know. They're anti-abortion, not pro-life. Because I mean, is there life after birth? It's something we have to ask. I never met anybody involved in any of those campaigns who was interested in poverty among children, for example. You know, it would have been interesting if they had different positions on those matters. Yeah, they were watching everything, and they were also being advised by right-wing American groups, and that continues right up until the campaign for repeal and the last referendum, thank goodness, successful, that we had in this country in 2018, which overturned the Eighth Amendment. But it was a backward step, and in a way, you'd always get that, like the great achievements of the 1970s, things like Women's Aid, which is still with us, the Rape Crisis Centre, which is still with us, AIM, which was set up to look at legal rights for women and children in the country. All of that created its own impetus. It was, as far as certain people were concerned, we were discussing things that should not be discussed. And that they grounded themselves in the battle against contraception, abortion, and divorce, the big three issues that they wished to hold back. Ultimately, of course, they didn't succeed, but it was, from their point of view, a highly successful campaign during the 1980s.
And as you say, it's interesting about where change happens. Was it those organizations in the 70s that you mentioned there, the Rape Crisis Centre, etc., that actually succeeded from the ground up, I suppose, in instigating change, outside the legal framework, as it were, which arguably, it's still the case, would you say, or where?
Combined, I mean, the battle for free legal aid, for example, for family law cases, was spearheaded through the courts by Josie Airy, who could not get free legal aid for a domestic case that she was interested in pursuing. And she went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights to get the right for free legal aid. And because of her, and again, this applies not just to domestic violence cases, but to all cases where people cannot afford their own legal counsel. And as we all know, the courts are incredibly expensive, arguably in a discriminatory way towards the distribution of justice. But at least there is free legal aid available for people due to her. Maureen de Burka, who people remember as an activist in the 70s, who's still with us, thank goodness, went to court to get the right for women to sit on juries, which had been abolished in 1926. She succeeded in that. Various other people went to court to look for taxation rights for married women, that they would get the same taxation rights as single women. So there's legislation and court cases going on all the time. It's not just the activism. And you know yourself, Suzanne, the only way that you can nail down significant change is through legislation. Once legislation is there, it has to be enforced and defended. And that's why, as you rightly said, Roe v. Wade, because while it was a decision of the Supreme Court, it depends on states' laws, that big bugbear in the United States, states' law versus federal law, for its implementation. And we see what's happening in places like Mississippi and Alabama at the moment, which is absolutely terrifying. I mean, what's happening in America is mind-boggling for anybody who believes in women's rights at the moment.
Yeah, it's fascinating though you just mentioned there the fact that, I don't know who it was, who is trying to restore the rights of women to sit in juries that had been abolished in 1926. So the fact that it's also a kind of salutary tale that you can have social advances and you can think the work is done, as with the cases you outlined at the beginning between 1860 and 1918, only to see that being rolled back. And it is a kind of a reminder about how nothing is certain, and you can't take issues for granted. But going forward and a little bit more towards, well, not that close to present day, but we have then in the mid-90s the divorce referendum, only 1995. Talk us through what happened there, or what was the impetus for that?
Again, the anti-divorce people were very strong. It was hello, divorce, goodbye, daddy. Every single emotional button that could be pressed was there. But at this point, there was a sufficient cohort of men and women who felt they deserved a second chance and they'd had enough of this carry on. And enough people in their families and their broader circles who understood them. We still have to remember that the 1995 referendum was carried with 50,000 votes. I remember I was with a whole bunch of friends that night on tenterhooks watching the results coming in. And, you know, looking at Roscommon as usual, disgracing itself. Anybody who's from Roscommon, forgive me, it was only in that one instance, it's a great county in all kinds of other ways. But they did do very badly on abortion and divorce. And just thinking, are we seriously going to have to do this again? You know, if people's marriages break down, what happens? Are they not entitled to a second chance? And luckily we won, and it was a great moment. That I mean, I was involved actively in all of these campaigns too. So that really did feel like something special, that after those two dreadful defeats, where people like me actually felt we did not belong in this country, that there was an active movement against us, against our way of thinking, which we didn't start, you know? I mean, we weren't saying, nobody sensible was saying you were going to have abortion in Ireland in the 1980s. There were a couple of small groups, some of whom I knew, who were advocating for that right, but they had nothing like the kind of support they would have needed to get it to happen. And again, it was pusillanimous politicians, both Gareth Fitzgerald and Charlie Hawley, who gave in to this pressure group, who threatened them with losing their votes if they didn't go along with it. And a campaign of hysteria and scaremongering in both cases that scared the hell out of a lot of people. But it did sort of lay bare something awful about the country at the time. That we thought in the 70s everything was moving forward. We were going to have paradise on earth. We'd get all the stuff that women wanted, and men, because what's good for women is good for men. And no, here we go, the backlash, which we should have been sensible enough to expect, but we didn't.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting points to make there, Catriona, listen to you, is the fact that you and people around you didn't feel like you had a part in that, in your country, in my previous life for a journalist, I did a PhD on Virginia Woolf, feminist writer, and she wrote one of her many feminist works was Three Guineas, and in it she has a famous line, "As a woman, I have no country." And her argument is all the things we spoke about at the beginning, you know, I'm not allowed to own property, I'm not allowed to vote, I am not part of the apparatus of the state, how can I have a nation? And it's a really interesting concept that, you know, the responsibility and you know, all men and women created equal in the context we see it in the US as well, and yet it's predicated on a very specific idea of gender.
That's absolutely true. And it's a long battle. I mean, I had the good fortune to meet Eric Hobsbawm, the great Marxist historian, once at a dinner. And he was very old at that point. I think he died about 2 years later. But I asked him, what did he think was the most significant revolution of the 20th century? And I expected him to say Russia or China or something else. And he said, undoubtedly, the women's revolution. And I was quite taken aback and very interested. And he said, women are 50% of the population. Ideas matter, that if you have a move towards the liberation of women in one part of the world, it will go everywhere. Now, as we know, there are many parts of the world today where women do not have anything, Afghanistan being primary among our horrified focuses at the moment, where women don't even have basic rights and where they're being treated atrociously. But the women's movement in the West did have a huge effect, and a whole lot of things for the better for women and for men.
I was just struck last week. I was writing a story here in Brussels about something was happening in the European Parliament and these new committees, and there's a women's right fem committee it's called, and there's a man who's been elected to chair it. So I rang him, I emailed and got a quick quote, and I rang him, and he was this amazing Polish MEP who I'd never heard about before. And he was fantastic. So he started off by saying to me, quoting Madeleine Albright, there's a special place in hell for men who don't help women. But he talked, which I found very moving and felt I need to know more about the situation in Poland. That Poland has got it's got a very right-wing government in power. It's really curtailing abortion rights and other, it's introducing pro-family laws all over the place. And he said to me, he said, I am very upset. I am now in a situation that Polish women are worse off now than they were when we joined the EU, and this should never have happened. And they should have the same rights as Spanish or Italian women. So, even within Europe, there are different countries with different standards. And, one would say, as you said there at the beginning, the EU did so much to bring Ireland on, and yet, and kind of force it into change. And yet we see some of the countries like Poland and Hungary here in Brussels, it kind of seems to have done the opposite, that they've gone more entrenched. So it's kind of interesting about the idea that every country, not every country, but a lot of countries are still on their own paths on these issues.
They are. As Eastern European countries are in a way a special case, because while they were behind the Iron Curtain, they had a lot of the sorts of rights that women had in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, they can be diminished hugely by lack of freedom of speech and all the other things that happen to people under those regimes. But you'll find with authoritarian states of the kind that we have under Viktor Orban in Hungary and the Polish government, that you'll often have a nostalgic return to the days when women stayed at home, and that's what they should be doing. The Nazis were pretty good at that too, of course. That they Kinder und Kuchen, stay at home, bake, and produce the next generation of Aryan warriors. Now, there's a lot of that nonsense. And your Polish friend is perfectly right. It's not just that women's rights are being denied. The government is also undermining its own judiciary. One of our Supreme Court judges, John McMenamin, went to march in Warsaw in solidarity with the Polish judiciary, who had protested about the fact that the judiciary was being politicized. We've been talking about people who were able to go to court here in Ireland, have access to independent judicial opinion, to gain certain rights that the state would not give them. If that's denied you, you're in really serious trouble. So it's perfectly right. It's a very dangerous time. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, at the moment in Ireland, well, not even at the moment, with the repeal the 8th referendum, I mean, you, through your own career and life, have lived through all these moments, not all of them, but since the 70s, these moments. I mean, was the repeal the 8th movement, was that again, you talked about after 1995, a kind of sense it was a huge milestone. Equally so, the repeal the 8th referendum, or
God, yeah, I never forget the night we got the result. I was down in the Project Arts Centre with some people I've been working on the campaign with, and we literally could not believe it. It was the exact flip. The polls didn't tell us it was going to be as good as it was. We still thought up to the last moment it was quite close. And the other side had fought valiantly to keep things the way they were. And suddenly somebody just looking at their phone said, oh my God, it's 64-4. And this must be a scam. It can't be right. And gradually we realized, no, it was there. And people actually started crying, including me, because it was just such a long haul. And so many women suffered so badly from this. It was unnecessary. It was cruel. It was vindictive. It led to absurd situations where the Irish people had to vote in a referendum on the right to travel. When you hear that, you realize there's something bonkers going on here.
The Irish solution to the Irish problem.
A child of 14 being denied. I mean, there were things going on that were just unimaginable. Women dying of cancer because they favored the child's life over theirs. It seemed we'd gone back into some sort of strange medieval stratosphere that wasn't familiar to any modern person. So to see the end of all of that, and to see the people who had fought valiantly for all of this, Mary Holland, who's dead now, was a wonderful journalist. I'm sure you know about and maybe knew, Suzanne. Mary Holland was the first woman in Ireland to come out and say she'd had an abortion. She did it very early. The amount of hatred and what Nell McCafferty called woman-hating pig slurry that descended on her head for that was just unimaginable. And that was before social media, which, by the way, is another thing women should be very careful about.
Yeah.
Those are the issues now. It's kind of, we're having huge debates here, as you know very well, about the ill effects of social media, particularly women, particularly on women in public, like politicians. Women who put their head above the parapet in any way are the victims of the most atrocious threats and vilification and vile stuff.
I mean, one of the issues I've seen about Repeal the 8, but of course, more recently, it's a different issue, obviously, and it's, you know, we don't want to conflate all these issues. But the Aisling Murphy case recently, which has again opened up a kind of national conversation about the treatment of women and violence against women in Irish society. What are your reflections on that?
I thought it was a terrible tragedy. I think there's nothing any government can do about some nut jumping out of the bushes and killing someone. You can't prevent that if somebody really wants to do it. However, the way it was framed, particularly by the National Women's Council, who, remember, are the direct successors to the Commission on the Status of Women, which became the Council for the Status of Women, which became the National Women's Council, which now is still there defending women's rights in Ireland. They framed it as a discussion about misogyny in Irish society. And that discussion badly needs to be had about casual, conversational dismissal, vilification, and threats against women, which goes on all the time, not to mention groping and all the stuff that we're familiar with, and of course, social media. So, I mean, I was glad that I think it was handled very well, because her family must have been going through, Aisling's family must have been going through the most unimaginable grief and sorrow and pain, and they needed to be left alone after a few days. That kind of support is wonderful. When something terrible has happened, then you need to grieve alone and be allowed to get on with it. And I think that was that people withdrew carefully and got back into the discussion. And they managed to get the Minister for Justice to agree that her forthcoming bill on domestic violence will go much further than they thought it would. What was interesting to me, though, was that a lot of the discussion was about where are the men? Why are men not taking up the banners here, like your Polish MP, Sean, on behalf of women and challenging other men about the sorts of jokes they make, for example. And there is an organization called the White Ribbon, the founder of whom I met about 7 or 8 years ago, which any man can join. You wear a white ribbon, and that white ribbon proclaims that you are opposed to any kind of violence against women. And every man I know would wear one. In fact, I'm going to be in the process of ordering a bunch of them for my chums shortly. But it just didn't feature. And I sent several texts to radio programs where the big debate was going on to say, there is actually an organization founded by men against violence against women. People can join this. And they didn't step up either, or if they did, they weren't listened to. So it's interesting that there are, we tend to get very black and white. I tend to do so myself, I'm afraid, sometimes, and say all men are bad because they're not actually making an effort to combat this kind of misogyny. There are men trying to combat this kind of misogyny, and a lot of men I know would definitely call somebody out in a bar conversation if they started telling foul jokes about women or whatever. But they need to actually formulate that into an organization and get going and defend their position. Otherwise, everyone gets tarred with the same brush. That's the problem.
Catriona, there's a task for you now to set up that organisation or encourage them to be more vocal. Just to encourage people to ask questions in the Q&A, I'm just going to take a few questions now. Okay, so Polo Driver, yeah, that's a good question. Could Catriona say a few words about the involvement of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church in all this? And this is obviously maybe going back further in our conversation, the role of John Charles McQuaid, the Archbishop of Dublin.
John Charles McQuaid, who towers over the city like a terrible colossus, as Frank MacDonald said about Frank Feely, one of the city managers. John Charles McQuaid is a really powerful archbishop. It's the church itself, rather than individual personalities that matter here. We recently, last year, had the publication of the report of investigation into mother and baby homes here in Ireland. The last of 3 major reports into the archipelago of carceral institutions, mainly for women and children, that we had in this country from before 1922 in the case of industrial schools and Magdalen laundries, post 22 in the case of mother and baby homes. And these things went on walls outside towns. Everyone knew what was going on. They were a considerable threat, mainly to young women who were told they'd be sent there if they stepped out of line. And we had a Catholic Church which was able to step into unheard of power after 1922. It was absolutely ready to do this. They had a government that was willing and able to hand over to them the control of education, health, and so-called welfare services. And they took to it like a duck to water and created those institutions, a very, very serious headlock on our education system, which is still there in many cases to this day, and control of our health services to a large degree. So as far as I'm concerned, the Catholic Church was a shadow state in Ireland for most of the 20th century. And one of my big bugbears is they will not release their records, particularly to people who survived these institutions and deserve to see them. The state should insist that those records are handed over and made public records. But we forget that if you're living in a society where everybody more or less feels the same, what we had after 1922 was a conservative, for the first time, landowning, because the Land Commission gave the land of Ireland back from landlord to tenant before 1922. 75% of the land was gone, creating a conservative Catholic peasant society that has a newfound interest in respectability, which is hugely encouraged by the Catholic Church. And that notion of respectability bears down most severely on young women and their children if they're born outside marriage. It becomes virtually impossible to get out of the feedback loop that's created by the church, the state, the local dignitaries, families. Some families did stand up against this stuff, but did not succeed. It took a long, long time to break down these barriers. And it's really, in terms of the Catholic Church's reputation, it's only when Mary Raftery and other people started to publicize sexual and physical abuse of children in these institutions that people started to think really seriously about the Catholic Church and its power and whether perhaps they might have misused it.
Yeah, but you touched on it there. Is there also not a question? I know this was quite controversial when the reports came out, but looking back now, that the complicity of society, and as you said, some people did stand up, but where was everybody? I mean, these things don't happen as a vacuum. Where is the media, the teachers, the guards, all these people, and it seems hard to understand. I find a generation gap to look back and say, yes, this was obviously just, it goes, I can't imagine living in a society like that, but everyone seemed to go along with it. And, where were the people who would stand up and be counted? Or was it just, as you say, it was just this homogenous block?
It really was very like a homogenous block, and anybody who stepped outside that was in trouble. And people were afraid of what would happen if they were to challenge the church. People were also seriously believing Catholics. They believed in hell, and that would happen if they did something wrong. That many, many families in Ireland had a priest or a nun in the family. That was seen as an enormous good thing to have. Spiritual capital, a priest or a nun in the family, all of this there. It's hard for us to imagine it now. I've described it as a closed feedback loop, where there's nothing else coming in. There's nothing else that you're going to be able to look at or see or understand or hear. Everything is run by the same people. And the church had unimaginable power. If your daughter got pregnant, her name was read off from the altar at Sunday Mass. Everyone wanted to avoid that and get the priest to help them to get this girl out of the way before the family could be shamed. It's a sort of, there's a book called Republic of Shame written by a wonderful young woman called Brigid that everyone should read. That whole imbuing of an entire population with shame has a terrible effect on people's ability to stand up for things. Because on the face of it, it is inhuman for parents to put their daughters into these dreadful institutions.
Yeah.
Like they often did. I mean, the stories that have emerged, no thanks to the commission, by the way, from the testimony that was given to the Commission on Mother and Baby Homes, tell us dreadful stories of collusion between mothers and priests, mothers disowning their daughters, or fathers disowning their daughters and mothers being afraid to go up against them. All of this is actually was dealt with brilliantly in 1987 by Tom Inglis in a book called The Moral Monopoly. And you can buy it online for very little, it's still there. Anybody who's a sociologist, and he looked at that closed feedback loop between church, state, and the Irish family. And it's fascinating to look at its findings on all of that.
Yeah, great. Cara McGregor asked a question. You probably kind of covered it, but with regard to the Catholic Church, you know, any more comments on the Magdalene laundries? I mean, you said there about where things stand in terms of inquiries. Anything to say on that?
Again, the Magdalene laundry investigation, which was headed up by Martin McAleese, was insufficient. Did not do its job. It didn't do the job we would have liked to have done, shall we say. It's been condemned by the UN Rapporteur on Torture for not condemning what happened in the Magdalene laundries as precisely torture. It's not regarded as an accurate representation of their experiences by the survivors. And there's still a way to go in terms of how Irish society and the Irish state deals with survivors of these different institutions. Part of it is society's own guilt at what went on, where people didn't stand up to it. And the easiest thing to do is just turn away and not look. It was easy then, it's easy now. Do not look at these suffering people who went through all of this and you know, were made to suffer for no good reason, because they have to get pregnant and have a child outside wedlock, or found wandering in the street because they were a poor child. This is what we did to them. So, and I don't like to get too hysterical about it either. I don't think I am, but I think those wounds remain in a society for a very long time. And they have to be dealt with properly and transparently. For that to happen, the church should be opening up its records and paying a hell of a lot more money towards redress than they have so far.
A few lots of questions coming in here, kind of on a similar theme, but a very good point here by Audrey McGee. Do you think that a post-colonialist inferiority complex played a role in that civil obedience to the church and state?
Yeah, in a way, yes, but it would be a sort of flip post-colonialism in the sense that there was a certain pride in our new Catholic state, right? We weren't British. The Irish language was lauded and proclaimed to eventually become the spoken language of most people. That ship had sailed long before we got our independence. It was never going to happen. The whole business of the idolization of small farms, the west of Ireland, the urban idea being British, essentially. People in cities, and particularly in the tenements, would be reading British newspapers and going to British music halls and doing all that kind of stuff. British and American culture were regarded as the devil themselves. That was a reaction against our experience with Britain. But it was an ideological, sort of rebellious post-colonialism in a sense. It's saying, on the one hand, we're glad that we're free of the shackles of empire. We're very proud of ourselves for doing that. On the other hand, we are now embracing an entirely different type of empire, one that has its headquarters in Rome rather than London. We're going to pay attention to them and do everything that they tell us because we trust them. And remember, the Catholic Church had become seen as a serious ally of ordinary Catholic people from Catholic emancipation in 1829 right through the 19th century, through the famine, through the land war, through all of those periods. The church supported people who were in trouble, and they were seen as great allies of the people. And there was a huge belief in Catholicism itself and how it worked. That takes a very long time to break down. But yeah, different kind of post-colonialism.
Yeah, another question here which picks up on this or fits nicely. Again, this is Carrick, and these are questions from the student at the lycée here in Brussels, who are finding this quite interesting, that this insight into Irish history from a feminist, if you like, perspective. But they make the point about threats and opportunities posed by, there's lots of discussion about Irish unity at the moment, but we've got a very strong Protestant conservatism now in the north. So there's a kind of an irony. We were talking about Ireland being a very self-consciously Catholic state and seeing a kind of a moral high ground of almost in that. I mean, do you see what's happening in the north? Do you worry about that, or what do you think about what's happening there within the political representatives?
Yeah, I mean, bad conscience prevails all over this bloody country in one way or another, right? The bad conscience of the Unionists in the north, and they know this perfectly well, but they can never admit it, is that they misruled that tiny province for a very, very, very long time and wish to continue to do so. And it is sectarian. Catholics have done much, much better than they have. They're complaining now, I see, that Catholics have a lot of people in the professions and in academia, and they're using this to make networks, etc. Suck it up, brother and sister. Go and get your own education. Create your own networks. Baroness Hoey has told them to do so. Follow her advice. And it's bad conscience the whole time. That unless they are absolutely devoid of brains, they know that what they did to the minority population in Northern Ireland after 1922, right up through the civil rights movement, was atrocious and unjustifiable. And they need a commission of inquiry into all of that wherever to get anywhere. So it's
about how they represent or answer or act for their own community and younger people, and encourage opportunities and give them something to work for and believe in.
Well, in many ways, the most hopeful statistic from Northern Ireland is, and it's fairly recent, that 40% of voters in Northern Ireland don't want to vote either for the DUP or Sinn Féin. They want to vote for the Alliance Party, the Green Party, and others. So that's interesting. When young people are moving away from these sectarian divides, Sinn Féin is far more successful at keeping young people attached to it. But you know, we know for a long time that the reason there's hardly an Ulster Unionist Party there anymore is because young middle class unionists went to England to go to college and never came back. What was in it for them? There was no next generation to take over from people like David Trimble. Whereas the DUP has a static population that still longs for a return to the old days of industrial heart, Belfast, for all of that. What's so very interesting, though, is the fact that Northern businessmen are as canny as anybody else is, you know, and they know that Brexit has been a disaster for them, but that the protocol is a gift, like it's a golden egg laid on their doorstep, that they can actually trade with Ireland and through Ireland with the EU and with the UK without any consequences. And why they're not becoming more vocal with their representatives in the DUP, I do not know.
Yeah, they're not economic. It's ideological, and people, you know, when it comes to it, that's why they vote. Okay, almost coming to an end here. There's another interesting question about, again, totally different historical context. It's a question about the Ladies' Land League in 1881 to 1882. It was active without being military. They fundraised, arranged the building of wooden houses for evicted families, and published the Land League newspaper. I didn't know that. So anything about the Ladies' Land League and how that was?
Well, the reason the Ladies' Land League existed was because the leaders of the Land League were all in jail. Parnell and Michael Davitt and so on were locked up. Anna Parnell, who was Charles Stewart Parnell's sister, ran it really efficiently, really well. Then when they all get out of jail, it's sidelined, another piece of patriarchy entering the equation. They weren't needed anymore. It's I suppose it's the old story. The men are at war or in prison. The women take over and do things really well. And then when the men come back, they slip back into position. That's a simplistic version of it, the way it went. But she's a very interesting woman. A lot of people are researching Anna Parnell now and getting interested in her. And we'll see, I think, some really good books in the near future about the Ladies' Land League. And rather tragic end, if I remember, but I can't precisely remember what. Fell out with her brother, if I'm right. But I mean, the women pop up all over the place all the time who are doing interesting, isolated things. But it's really when you get organizational movement that things start to change. When you get people moving in the same direction with the same objective, like the referendum campaigns, for example, that things do actually start to change.
And then who writes history and who represents history, and a lot of these women got neglected by the storytellers, the history tellers, and it's about retrieving them now into their rightful place.
Well, you know, that kind of annoys me because Margaret Ward wrote on Manageable Revolutions in 1985. We've had a thriving women's history sector here since the 80s. You know, yes, women were written out of history before the 80s, probably we expect. But it's up to women themselves to do that job, and we're doing it. There's some wonderful work out there by people like Senya Paseta, Lucy McDermott, Louise Ryan. I could name hundreds of really good female historians who are doing the job that we want them to do, who are delving into the archives, finding stuff we didn't know before. all the stuff that was done about suffrage on the anniversary in 2018 was really illuminating and really good. We have 3 biographies of Constance Markovich now, believe it or not, and biographies of other interesting people like Rosamund Jacob, who a lot of people wouldn't have heard of, but who kept an amazing diary for 60 years and who's fascinating to look at. So that's all emerging, but has been happening for a long time. It isn't just the decade of centenaries. And the women who matter are not only members of Common Lemon. We have to remember this. There were lots of other women doing interesting work right through the last 100, 200 years in this country who deserve a look. Anna Haslam has a good biography, which she could do with another one now. An absolute heroine of Irish women's rights. So we need not to be so fixated on the ladies with the guns or who were carrying guns and dispatches during the War of Independence. We need to know about them. They're hugely important. We know all about them now because we have the Bureau of Military History, where they made statements in the 1940s, and we can read those statements and know more about them. But we need to look more at the likes of Hilda Tweedy, who probably did more for women's rights than most people ever did, and hardly knows who she is now.
Yeah. Another question coming in here, Catherine. She posed the question: nuns, a help or hindrance for the women's movement in Ireland? She says she's an atheist personally because of nuns, but she also owes the nuns a debt of gratitude for education and rebellious attitude.
Was that rebellious attitude against the nuns or because the nuns were rebellious themselves?
Well, yeah, this maybe a lot of people of a generation feel that they got good education in one sense and feel that's ambivalence towards nuns as women, as
this is a very small country. We shouldn't forget that. We don't have a large population. We have a much bigger population now than we've had at any time since the famine, which is extraordinary. A lot of people had nuns in their families. I, in my own family, have a Carmelite nun whose favorite hobby now in her old age is watching Formula One racing on the television. You wouldn't expect a nun to be doing that. Instead of being at her prayers, she's watching Schumacher and cheering them on. She's a lovely woman. She's a Carmelite, so she's in a contemplative order, which always strikes me as an interesting thing to do. The nuns who ran education and health and all the rest of it, from a certain point of view, you're looking at women who want some power in a society that will not give it to single women, right? If you go into a religious order and you progress to the top, you're somebody with quite a lot of power. You're able to influence the education of generations of young women and girls. You're able to manage a hospital. And they were very good at this in the sense of, everyone complains now about how the hospitals are dirty. Bring the nuns back and they'd be clean. They were always clean when the nuns were there. But it's the bad stuff that is so distressing. And it's one thing to say, yes, it's a mixed bag. I got a great education with Dominican nuns. And they made me rebellious too, because I had many arguments with them about various things they had to say. They seemed not to mind that, which was nice in the 1960s. I have no bone to pick with them particularly. The problem is that what you have is a huge cohort of society that are running all sorts of things, including Magdalen laundries, including mother and baby homes and industrial schools. And while a lot of them behaved well, a lot of them behaved really badly, and the other ones didn't call them out. That's the problem. Now, they're probably part of the closed feedback loop of cruelty and submission that I described earlier to a large degree. But it's hard to imagine how a grown woman could look at a child standing in a freezing cold yard holding up a wet sheet from its bed for half the morning and not weep at that. Cruelty of doing that to a small child, particularly the cruelty to small children, is really incomprehensible. That you cannot, and we know there's testimony there to tell us this happened. I weep for the small children. I'm sorry, and I wish that the congregations now would just step up and say, look, they have apologized, but the apologies had to be dragged out of them in some cases. And some haven't apologized at all. And just do the right thing. Just open up your records so people can see what happened and pay whatever money you have towards redress to the people who went through these systems that you oversaw. Just, behave like Christian people, I suppose. these people are supposed to be dedicating themselves to improving the lives of human beings, and they did the exact opposite. That must be terribly hard to live with.
Yeah, this leads on to another question, actually, nearly coming to an end now, but from Peter Reid, about do you have views on the ongoing saga of the National Maternity Hospital and the refusal by the government to arrest it from the, as Peter says, the clutches of the church in the form of the nuns who own the site. So any views on that?
I have two views on that. One is I completely understand why Rona O'Mahony wanted it to go ahead. I know her. She was a fantastic master of Holles Street. Holles Street was falling down. It gets to the point where you say, I really can't bear this anymore. I don't care what the strings are, just build the damn thing and we'll argue about it afterwards. Her brother-in-law, Peter Boylan, is the one who has actually highlighted the issue with the church's ownership of it. I think the government might have forgotten that they have a wonderful thing at their disposal called the compulsory purchase order, which used to be used all the time in the 1930s and the 1950s to purchase land at a reasonable rate for the good of the state, mainly for housing or for roads or whatever, where you didn't have to pay the inflated market price that people are looking for now. They could do that in this case and take it over. Of course, the National Maternity Hospital should be fully vested in the state. The nuns have given guarantees that they will not impose their regime in any way, and they probably won't, but it shouldn't be there even as a shadow in the background. But I understand Rona, and I think if I were her, I'd be saying, oh, for the love of God, have you had a look inside the door of Holles Street? Remember, Holles Street is one of the chapters in Ulysses. Today is the 100th anniversary of the publication of that wonderful book. The oxen of the sun, Mina Purefoy, is giving birth in a run-down hospital called Holles Street. And we're still there today. Women deserve much better than that. And I understand her feelings about it. Everything here seems, where's the National Children's Hospital, for example? Why does everything take so long? It's a question people need to ask themselves more and more and more. Why does everything take so long? You know, we should be able to run a state in a timely, efficient way to give people services that they need and desire.
I mean, maybe this is probably a debate for another day, but I think there's a really interesting question about representation of women in politics and political priorities. Governments make choices. They have a lot of pressure on resources, obviously, but they make choices, they make priorities, and who are making those choices? That's
and
why
we need to look at our public service, and we need to look at women in the public service and men, and what power they have and how that is used. Blocks to getting on with projects that are badly needed, both in and in other parts of the country. And we know we can do it because we did it before. Back in the 1980s, we were building fantastic public housing all over Dublin, like a good time, and consulting with its ultimate users, which means those houses are still cherished by their owners, looked after, and wonderful. We can do this. I just don't, I cannot figure out what is wrong with this at the moment.
Okay. With a final question, which is a bit more, well, just to kind of close things off, we have a question here. What are your thoughts on feminism in Ireland today? Is there still a place for it? And what do you feel the challenges for young women today?
Oh, I think there'll always be a place for feminism. And we should remember one of the most successful television series in history went out over the last 3 years. Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's great allegory about an oppressive society where women are reduced to their breeding function. And we should remember that we've gained a lot of rights. Rights can be taken away. I don't think that is likely to happen in Ireland anytime soon, but you never know. I have nieces of whom I'm crazy about. They're all ardent feminists. They read all the feminist stuff. They read Kate Moran and all the wonderful stuff that's there. They've all been involved in the campaigns for Peel in particular. And of course, they're interested in what I tend to dismiss a little as identity politics, the whole business of gender fluidity, how that works, which I tend to think can sometimes be a little bit of a distraction. I just think whatever anybody wants to be, let them be it. Shouldn't be a problem about it. Just make provision for people to identify as whatever they want. It doesn't need a long discussion, or shouldn't. But feminism, because of its nature, spreads into all kinds of other areas. You know, housing is a feminist issue. Health is a feminist issue. The things that affect everybody affect women, sometimes more so. And a lot of young women are involved now in those kinds of campaigns, and particularly in the campaign against social media and what it's up to. Lady Gaga, who is a very astute political commentator, describes social media as the toilet of the internet. And I don't think she's wrong. I would love to see a lot of people just saying, I've had my fill of Twitter, I'm getting off it, thank you. I've never done it, but that's because I don't believe in making Jack Dorsey any richer than he already is. He's obscenely wealthy, and I don't want to add to it, or Mark Zuckerberg or any of those guys. They're all guys, except for Sheryl Sandberg, who's a sellout. We have to watch what's happening in what is effectively the takeover of our consciousness and communications by private corporations. It's an outrageous idea that we would freely hand over intimate, important information, pictures of ourselves, intimate details of our lives, to private corporations who are not responsible or accountable to anyone. And that is affecting women really, really badly, because they see the fuzzy edges of this, where you can have a lovely WhatsApp group and have lovely chats with all your chums and stay in contact, and Facebook pages where people talk to each other. No, do it some other way, because the consequences of this in terms of what we've been seeing over the past 20 years are terrifying, and particularly for young women. The shaming of young women on social media is disgusting, frightening, and dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's a very important place to finish off, where maybe the new challenge is now in this year of 2022. So Catriona, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. We could continue all day, but I'm sure, as you say, that this conversation is not over. It's always in the process of being refashioned and reformed. So lots of food for thought there. Thank you very much to everyone for attending and for your questions. Thank you very much to the ambassador and to Eddie Brannigan, who put this initiative in place late last year. Thank you all, and a very happy St. Brigid's Day to you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.